Okay, so the process on how we arrived at today's video is a little bit convoluted, so follow along with me and try not to get lost on this road, okay? As long as you're not Zoro, I think you'll be fine. Alright, so the other day on the channel, I did a live stream, and I have this giant packet with me here, and this packet contains 150 One Piece related questions and thought experiments. It was sent to me by a fan named Charles, so thank you, Charles, for this. And during the stream, I just have my chat just like read out random numbers, and I pick one, and I just read one of these, okay? So this is the question that sparked this. This was the beginning, okay? Question number 13, how apt. Can Pika control people or objects transformed into stone by the power of Boa Hancock? Okay, so obviously, Boa Hancock has the power of the Love no Mi, the Love fruit, and she has the ability to turn people into stone that harbor any sort of, like, feelings or, you know, lecherous thoughts about her. Although not really, because she has other abilities that can turn, like, pacifistas and random objects into stone as well. I'm getting off topic already, but Boa Hancock's ability allows her to turn people and objects into stone, alright? We all on the same page on that? Alright. So Pika's ability is the Ishi no Mi, the stone assimilation fruit, okay? So he can take anything that's made of stone and kind of like combine it with himself, and so he can form into a giant mountain, and he can shape that into the form of his body, or he could do whatever he wants with it. He can make like a giant sword out of stone as long as he like assimilates into it first, okay? So he has to be part of existing stone. He's not a Logia, but as long as there's stone present, he can shape it into whatever form he wants. So the question is, okay, if Boa Hancock turns somebody into stone, could Pika like absorb that stone statue into himself for his stone powers, okay? So that was the beginning of that question, and that led to me starting to think about, like, Dr. Stone, the whole premise of Dr. Stone being some kind of petrification ray that turns the entire planet, every human being on the planet, into a stone statue, and then I started to think, like, wait a second, whoa! Back up here! If Boa Hancock has that power to turn people into stone, is it the same thing in Dr. Stone? Because in Dr. Stone, you know, this isn't really too much of a spoiler, because this is revealed within the first arc of the story. If you haven't read it or watched it, please go read and watch Dr. Stone. It's incredible. Sosoruze korewa. Alright, so, in Dr. Stone, though, when you turn into a stone statue, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like a way to preserve you. Preservation, okay? And so when you get released from the stone, you know, it's like thousands of years later, and you're perfectly fine, and it like heals all your wounds in the process. It's like a revitalization kind of method. So then I started to think, wait a second, even if it's not the exact same thing that Boa Hancock is capable of, could she turn somebody into stone, and then they could just remain in, like, cryogenic stasis? Not cryogenic, they're not frozen, but, like, just remain in stasis for, like, weeks, years, decades. And then, like, if someone was turned into stone at age 25, and then they were released from the stone 50 years later, they would still be 25, right? Like, they would just be perfectly preserved in the stone, all right? Because we haven't really seen this in long-term effect. We've only seen Boa Hancock, like, turn the Marines into stone, and then, like, Marigold and the other members of, like, the Amazon Lily tribe, and then she immediately turned them back within, like, a couple days at most. Like, she turned the Marines on Momonga's ship into stone, and then she left, and she came back, like, a week later, and she unstoned them, as it were, okay? So that brings up questions. Okay, so we're not even through the rest of this, okay? So I arrived at that conclusion, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna make a whole video about that, but wait, there's more. Then I arrived at the problem of, like, okay, well, what if Boa Hancock dies after she turns somebody into stone? Is it going to be a case where they stay stone, or they immediately turn back into humans because the user of the devil fruit died? And then that arrived me at the final point in the purpose of this video: devil fruit powers after death. Post-death devil fruit abilities, like post-Nen in Hunter x Hunter or whatever, okay? And you might just say, like, when a devil fruit user dies, all of the effects of their ability disappear. But there's some cases in the story where that is clearly not the case, and there's some cases where it is. So some of the most obvious ones on, like, if the user dies, the effect of the ability ends right there. So you have Sugar's Hobby no Mi, right? So Sugar has the ability to turn people and things into toys, and she can make contract with the toys, and the toys can do whatever she orders, okay? Now, in the story, the way that they nullified that ability was knocking Sugar out, okay? But I would assume that if the ability would end if you get knocked unconscious, it would also end if you died as well. So if Sugar turned like 1,000 people into toys and then she died, all those thousands of people would turn back into human beings right there on the spot, okay? Same thing with Moriya's Kage Kage no Mi, the shadow fruit, okay? Because Moriya also lost consciousness on Thriller Bark, and then all of the shadows he spewed out of himself, and they all went back to their original owners, okay? I would also stand to reason, I would stand to reason, if an ability is nullified because you lose consciousness, it is also nullified in the exact same way if you die, okay? However, one thing to keep in mind about Moriya, I don't know if this matters, it might, but Moriya didn't just, like, lose consciousness when the shadows were around Thriller Bark in the zombie hosts, okay? He actually ripped all of the shadows out of the zombies and incorporated all 1,000 of them, you know, give or take a few, into himself to create Shadows Asgard, which, by the way, that's a pretty badass name for an attack. I don't think Moriya is anybody's, like, favorite warlord out there. I mean, I'm sure at least one person is probably like, Moriya's my favorite warlord. It's like, okay, that's fine. You know, the fact is, he's really not that cool, but Shadows Asgard, that was a cool move, okay? Well, anyway, he took all these shadows into himself, and then Luffy knocked him out, and then he had his stomach pumped with the giant pillar that fell on top of him. He lost consciousness, and he was kind of like fading in and out, even as the master of shadows. That was a lot to take in, and then he lost consciousness, and he vomited out all of the shadows, and they all went back to their original owners, no matter how far away on the other side of the planet they were, okay? That's what happened, okay? So, the question is, if Moriya just lost consciousness, you know, when he was just in his normal body, he didn't, like, rip the shadows out of, like, zombie Lola or whatever, if he just went unconscious that way, or if he died, would the shadows go back to their original owners, or would they just stay in the zombies? Unless, you know, he actually took them into himself and then actually lost consciousness with all of them inside of him. So that's a question. I guess that's a thought experiment you can have. And then, of course, we have probably the best example of all of this of a character that actually did die, because that doesn't happen super often in One Piece, but a character that did die, that did have a devil fruit with an active effect, and it was expressly shown in the story as soon as they were dead, the effect ended right there. And that is, of course, Corazon, or Doflamingo's younger brother, Don Quixote Rocinante, okay? Because he had the Calm fruit, the ability to, like, turn off sound or, like, sound absorption, you know, no sound could enter a certain area. And so right before he died, right before he got shot by Doflamingo, he, like, touched Law on the head, and he's like, silence. And then so Law, no matter how much he screamed and cried over the death of Corazon, he wouldn't make a sound, okay? And it was stated by Corazon directly, like, I have to stay alive as much as possible, as long as possible, even with all the bullets in him, and he's losing a lot of blood. He's like, I have to hang on, because the second I die, the effects of my devil fruit will end, and then Law will be able to be heard again, and then that's when Doflamingo will find him, and I can't let that happen, okay? And so eventually Rocinante did die, and the effect did end. Now, Law was very lucky at that one particular instance, because he was, like, running away. He was already a distance away, and then the explosions from the battleships were happening in the background. Osaru was, like, bombarding Doflamingo's ship, so even though Law, he could be heard again, you know, his voice, his crying got drowned out by the explosions. So he got lucky, but that was an example right there where Corazon died, the devil fruit's effect ended, okay? So, those are examples of that. Also, wait, no, there is actually one more. Beiji, because it was also stated in Tautland directly by Beiji when he turned into Big Father, and everybody was inside of his castle and it was being attacked by Big Mom on the outside. Beiji did say, if the castle is destroyed, I die. And if I die, everybody in here gets ejected immediately. Which brings up a question with, we know that as soon as you eat the devil fruit, you learn the name of the devil fruit. That kind of brings up the question of whether devil fruits actually do have some level of sentience or whatever, like some living thing is inside devil fruits, so you take a bite of them, and that sentience kind of like tells you what the name is. Like, this is the Gamu Gamu no Mi. It gives you the ability to turn into rubber. Maybe if that is the case and you learn about the name of it and what the powers are, maybe you learn about, like, what happens if you die with this ability active, okay? Because Beiji seemed to know, because typically you only die once, unless you're Brook. Yo ho ho ho! And so with the case with Beiji, he just knew that, like, hey, if I die while you guys are in here, you all get kicked out of the castle, okay? It wasn't like a matter of if, it was a matter of this is what's going to happen. So how else would Beiji know that, right? So those are examples of devil fruit abilities that definitely end in one way, shape, or form if the user is knocked unconscious or if they die, okay? But that is not the standard for every devil fruit, okay? So now let's take a look at devil fruits that create substances, all right? So we have mostly paramecias here. We'll be getting to logias in a second, just hold on, but let's tackle the paramecias first, okay? So for example here, let's take Mr. 3 Galdino's Doru Doru no Mi, not the Dor fruit, the Doru Doru, the wax fruit, okay? With the ability to create wax, and then let's take Magellan's poison fruit, his Doku no Mi, okay? The ability to generate poison, all right? So with Mr. 3 Galdino, he's working for Buggy right now. So let's say Buggy, it's his birthday under the big top, and Mr. 3 is going to make him a birthday cake, and he makes like this giant wax candle to go on the birthday cake. But at the same time, he's about to put the wax candle on top of the birthday cake. He slips on some of the frosting, falls down, and he dies. All right, and it's like, well, that's the end of Mr. 3 right there. Now, what happens to the giant wax candle he created? He already created it. He already molded it. Does the wax candle just disappear? Because it didn't exist until he created it with his devil fruit abilities, okay? You know, that wasn't like regular wax that he grabbed and molded or whatever. No, that was wax created out of his own body with his devil fruit ability, and now he's dead, and the Doro Doro no Mi leaves his body and goes and migrates to a new fruit. Does that wax candle just stay there, or does it blip out of existence? Same thing with Magellan's poison. So Magellan creates a bunch of poison, and he attacks Blackbeard with it. Let's say Blackbeard were to get lucky. Let's say the same time that Magellan fired the Hydra at Blackbeard, Blackbeard, you know, used his Yami Yami no Mi, or, you know, Van Augur took a shot at him or whatever, and hit Magellan right in the face, and he's dead, okay? He died right there, okay? Just perfect shot. He got a crit, okay? So Magellan dies, but the Hydra, with I assume the dragon form of the Hydra, like the ability to control it like a dragon, that would just disappear. Like that would fall apart right there. But if Blackbeard and everybody got washed over with the poison, would the poison just vanish? Obviously, if you were already poisoned by Magellan, I don't think anything could save you there other than the actual antidote, okay? So if you got poisoned by Magellan and Magellan were to immediately die, it's not like the poison's gonna be like it's gonna disappear from your system. You're still poisoned. Or would it, though? That's the question, right? So when it comes to generating sort of like actual things in the world, like wax or poison or whatever, I would say those things would stick around. Even if you die and the fruit is reincarnated right after you summoned it, they would stick around, okay? When it comes to more like effect-based devil fruits, like the effect of turning people into toys, or manipulating shadows, or, you know, creating like a soundproof barrier, those are like more abstract effects rather than actually creating a substance. So those would vanish with your devil fruit ability when you died, but the substances would remain, okay? So there's a bunch of different examples you could look at with paramecias. But now let's look at logias, okay? Because logias, we've definitely seen effects of logias from, you know, years, maybe decades, maybe centuries past, okay? So, when I say that we've seen this, it's very likely this is the case. It hasn't been confirmed, but I think that this is the direction Oda is going. It's pretty apparent. Okay, so Aokiji and Aka Inu fought on Punk Hazard, right? Punk Hazard was just a bombed-out ruin. It was a wasteland when Aka Inu and Aokiji showed up. And then they fought, I think, for like 10 days or so, and then half of the island got turned into a volcanic hellscape, half of it turned into the Arctic, okay? And then both of the fighters left the island, right? And it just remains like that, you know, over a year later. This is still the case, okay? Now, if Aka Inu or Aokiji were to die, would that mean that the island of Punk Hazard would just turn back to normal? Like if Aokiji were to die, the Arctic tundra would just disappear? I think it's pretty obvious that it would not. They permanently altered the weather by fighting there with their respective devil fruits, which are also probably awakened logias. And we see so far in the story, at least the idea that, you know, Oda is presenting, at least I think, is that awakened logias are able to affect the weather permanently in a region. This could be the example that we've been waiting for. This could be the explanation on why there's so many random weather events in the Grand Line. Because back in the day, there was a bunch of really strong logias, and, you know, like 800 years ago, somebody else had the Goro Goro no Mi, and then they died, and then a couple hundred years later, somebody else had the Goro Goro no Mi, and then they died, all the way up until you get to Eneru. So Raijin Island, I've said this before, definitely, Raijin Island, the reason why it's constantly bombarded with lightning rain could just be a weird weather pattern in the Grand Line, or it could be a previous user of the Goro Goro no Mi that awakened the power like 300 years ago, and it's constantly being affected by this, okay? Punk Hazard is always going to look like this now, unless some other other Devil Fruit user gets involved, some other awakened Logia, and nullifies the ability. Maybe Akainu or Aokiji, if they really wanted to, maybe they could go back to Punk Hazard and, like, somehow absorb the elements back into themselves to cancel it out. Maybe they could do that. I don't see any reason why they would. They don't really care. It's just a, you know, for all they knew, it was just a wasteland, just a deserted island. That's why they fought there, right? But maybe they might be able to do that. But unless some other Devil Fruit user gets involved, Punk Hazard will always look like this, probably for hundreds and hundreds of years. Maybe eventually the power would wear off. Maybe it might take thousands of years or 10,000s of years, but eventually the power would weaken and it would no longer, you know, exhibit that trait. Like eventually the snow would melt, the volcanoes would become extinct, but that would take a really, really long time. From what we understand so far right now, this is kind of a permanent thing as long as, like, humans are alive, you know, for all intents and purposes, right? So in that case, yeah, I would say those are Devil Fruit abilities that persist after death. So that got me thinking, now, what if it's not just awakened Logias, it's any kind of awakening, okay? Now, when it comes to awakened Paramecias, the way Doflamingo explained it was that when you awaken a power, it allows to affect things other than your own body. So with the Ito no Mi, he was able to turn the surrounding houses and the streets of Dressrosa into string. And then the same thing with Katakuri being able to turn things into mochi, alright? So if Doflamingo turns a house into string, and then Doflamingo were to die right after that, would the house turn back into normal, or would it stay string? That's where we start getting into questions, okay? Because it's not a normal Devil Fruit ability at that point, it's an awakening Devil Fruit ability. It might permanently be altered in that form. It might be permanently altered in that form, because at that point, unless Doflamingo himself actively decides to turn it off, it might just stay string. Same thing with Katakuri's mochi, okay? Also, since Katakuri fought in the mirror world, that was another question I had involving Brulee's ability, the mirror fruit. Does the mirror dimension only exist as long as somebody has the power of the mirror fruit? What happens if there's people inside of the mirror world when Brulee dies? Is it like Beiji's, where they all just get ejected from the mirror world immediately? Where did they get ejected out from? Do they just get sucked into the nearest mirror when Brulee dies and they just pop out wherever? Or do they just, once again, are they stuck in the mirror world and they cannot leave anymore? Or maybe they can leave, but they can't go back in. I don't know. That's a question, right? Does that space, it's like a pseudo-dimension that Brulee creates with her abilities. Does that dimension only exist when a Devil Fruit user exists? There's a question for you. Also, that brings up another one, though. It's just, it keeps going down and down the rabbit hole, right? Okay? Hashtag not a furry, of course. But yeah, okay, here's another one, though. Previous users of Devil Fruits like the current user affecting previous user Devil Fruit creations, okay? So, like, for example, the previous user of the Love fruit. We don't know who that is. But let's say 100 years ago, there was another person that had Boa Hancock's ability, and she turned somebody to stone. And then they died. And then 100 years go by, and they're still stone. Let's just say it is like Dr. Stone rules, okay? Even though the previous user of the Love fruit died, the person they turned to stone is, like, in cryogenic stasis, frozen in time, as a stone statue, okay? And they managed to survive for 100 years. And then Boa Hancock gets the ability, even though it wasn't her that turned that person into stone, would she be able to do the same ability, because it's the same power, and turn them back into regular human? That's the idea I was getting to, okay? If the power does persist after death, this could lead into a bunch of different things. You could have somebody back during the Void Century that has the power of the Love fruit and, like, froze Joy Boy as a stone statue and hid him away somewhere in the world, and then Boa Hancock could use her powers to reawaken him. Now, that would be very interesting, because the way that Joy Boy's been talked about, like, he is going to return someday, but it's very ambiguous on what that means. Right now, it does seem to be like some kind of title. Like, the idea of Joy Boy is not like a person per se, it's like a title that somebody has, and then somebody else in the current storyline, like Luffy, for example, is a candidate to receive that title. But it could also be, like, traveling through time with, like, Toki's power. Like, Joy Boy existed 900 years ago, and then the previous user of the Time Fruit used their abilities to send him into, you know, the future, and then they died, and then Toki got the power, and so Toki might not have been the person that sent Joy Boy into the future, but somebody else might have with the same ability. Or it could have been, like, the Frozen, the Stasis, turn you into stone, lock him away somewhere in a vault, maybe on Laugh Tale or something. Maybe that's what Roger was laughing at. He opened up the door, and when he said, like, Joy Boy, I wish I lived in your time, that wasn't him just like, oh, he read the name Joy Boy on a carving or whatever, like, Joy Boy, you're such a funny person. No, what if it was like the statue of Joy Boy and the statue of Poseidon in the like vault at Laughtail, whatever it was, where they were at, and they were frozen by the previous user of the Love fruit to, you know, remain there until the time comes. And then like it has an inscription in a poneglyph or something like, do not reawaken until this exact time. And it was before Roger was there. And obviously Roger didn't have access to the Love fruit or anything like that. So that's maybe another reason why he said like, oh, well, looks like we can't do anything here, Rayleigh and Odin. You know, we got here too early. What are you gonna do? Guess we'll just call it Laughtail, call it a day, disband the crew, right? Maybe it was like the actual statue who Joy Boy was, right? That's very interesting. And the second coming of Joy Boy is literally that. Like, you know, Boa Hancock will show up and use her abilities to nullify the power, and then, you know, Joy Boy's back again. Maybe Poseidon would have been frozen in stone too. So you see how the road, it winds, you know, how do you arrive at certain conclusions? Oh my god. I have a few other questions to bring up here, the same basic premise, but this really does seem to be a thing where I would not say Oda is inconsistent. It's just the very nature of Devil Fruits lends to unpredictability. Okay, yes, we have the different categories that follow, like, okay, Logias are elements, zones are animals, paramecias or whatever. By the way, zones, oh yeah, that's another question I gotta bring up. Okay, what happens if Chopper dies? What happens if Chopper is in his brain point or his human point and he dies? You would assume he just turns back into a regular reindeer, right? But remember the time at Ennie's lobby when he was in Monster Point and Frankie's like, okay, I'm gonna blast him into the water because that'll nullify the Devil Fruit abilities, even though it doesn't really nullify, it just weakens you. Well, anyway, regardless, Chopper lost consciousness and he turned back not into his regular reindeer form, he turned back into his brain point form. So after getting knocked into the water and getting drained and going unconscious, he reverted from Monster Point to Brain Point. So that's some questions there. Like, you'd think he would turn back into a regular reindeer. If Chopper were to die, would he just turn back into his reindeer form and then it's just a dead reindeer sitting on the ground? He'd be like, that's sad. But would that happen with any zone? Question, or would they remain in the form that they died in? Like, if they managed to kill Kaido while he's a dragon, Zoro sliced off Kaido's dragon head. It's like, no! Boom! Would the body then revert to, like, you know, the snake tail of the dragon, turn back into Kaido's body without a head, and then the dragon head, like the horns and stuff, would disappear, and then it would just be Kaido's decapitated head sitting there? How would that go? Let's see, who else did I write down here? Ivankov. This is an effect that I'm pretty sure would remain. If Ivankov used the powers of the hormone fruit to turn somebody from a man to a woman or a woman to a man, and then Ivankov were to die, I'm pretty sure, considering that Ivankov uses the abilities to reshape the hormones and the genetics of the human body at that point, you would remain in that state. Okay, so if you were, you know, biologically male originally, and you got turned into a woman, and then Ivankov died, I don't think you would revert from a woman back to a man. You would stay, you know, whatever form that you were in at that point, okay? So I think that's a case of it lasting after death. What else here? Kuma! Alright, this is an interesting one. So, Bartholomew Kuma has the power of the Paw fruit, okay? So, what happens if Kuma sends somebody flying for 3 days and 3 nights, but then dies before that time period is up? So, for example, he sends Luffy to Amazon Lily from Sabaody Archipelago, right? Pop sends him flying away. And then what happens if he immediately dies? Something happens. He gets crushed by a meteor or something. I don't know. And then Kuma's dead. Like, let's say a day and a half into this. Would the bubble that was protecting Luffy just pop and then Luffy just falls into the ocean? Or would the effect of the fruit continue until he reached its destination and then it would disappear and then it would be gone? And, you know, I also started to think, like, does this work in similar rules to post-death Nen from Hunter x Hunter? Obviously not the exact same thing, because, you know, Devil Fruit powers and Nen are very, very different power systems, but the premise in Hunter x Hunter is Nen does not always persist after death, only in certain circumstances, when the person that died harbors very negative emotions towards somebody, right? Like, for example, if maybe somebody had a Nen ability to curse another person, and then they died, but they still really hated that person, even after the death of that Nen user, the curse will linger on the person that they hated, okay? So it's something like that, where if you have like a really strong emotion, or if you're really, really strong, or something like that, the Nen will persist. So maybe not so much with emotions, but maybe so much with training and strength. Like if you do train with your Devil Fruit and you have it for a very long period of time, and let's say you do awaken it, then you change something, because of that level of strength, it won't disappear even after you die and the fruit is reincarnated, okay? I don't know if there is a method to permanently destroy a devil fruit, as long as we're aware in the story so far. Vegapunk might have figured something out. But as far as we're concerned, when you die, your fruit gets reincarnated into a fruit. And even if, like, the fruit were to be physically destroyed, like Luffy were to die and the Gomu Gomu no Mi got reincarnated, somebody picks the Gomu Gomu no Mi and, like, throws it in an incinerator or something, or just completely destroys it. Even in that case, I don't think the devil fruit's gone forever. The aura, the power of the fruit would just leave the destroyed Gomu Gomu no Mi and go and find another fruit to inhabit, okay? And so that's basically what I would assume would happen, okay? I don't think it's ever been really explained in a story of anybody actively trying to destroy a devil fruit, because these things, even if you don't want to eat them, they're still very, very valuable on the black market, and the Marines, even with the Oppi Oppi no Mi, they were willing to pay 10 billion berries for this, okay? So, you know, obviously destroying them, probably not a good idea, but what would happen if you attempted to? You know, not just, like, crush it or destroy it that way, but actually, like, destroy it, like burning it or blowing it up. Like, what would happen then, right? I would assume it would just get reincarnated again. But let's just assume, hypothetically, Vegapunk figured out some way to permanently eliminate a devil fruit from existence. You know, nobody has it, and the fruit doesn't exist, it's just gone forever. If that's the case, going back to the awakened powers, like, if Aokiji's Hiei Hiei no Mi was permanently annihilated from existence, would then the effects on Punk Hazard disappear? Because you could say that. You could say even if Boa dies, it still makes sense for the stone statues to exist, because the power of the fruit still does exist. It's not only Boa is dead, the power still exists somewhere, but if the power is gone permanently, then would everything that was ever affected by the Love fruit turn back to normal? If the power of the Goro Goro no Mi was gone, would Raijin Island turn back to the way it was before that, if that was really the thing that was affecting it? There's the questions for you today. I'm not really sure, but those are just some examples I had. Oh, I also had one more, Pika. I also wrote him down here because, yeah, when Pika turned into the giant mountain, Pika got knocked unconscious and he got removed from Dressrosa. He didn't die, but Dressrosa is still permanently altered because of that. Unless Pika were to return to the island and mold it back into the way it was, it is permanently stuck like that, with, like, the giant decapitated statue of Pika as, like, a mountain up there and the giant spikes shooting out and everything. So, yeah, that's still the case right there. And even if Pika were to die, I think that Dressrosa would remain like that permanently, right? Well, anyway, let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. There's a bunch of different devil fruits I did not discuss today because there's so many. I didn't want to go through, like, every single one. Like, you could arrive at a lot of funny conclusions, though. Like, what would happen if Buggy were to separate his body and then he were to die? Would his body parts just all fall apart and, like, blood starts seeping out of all of them? You know, would he, you know, combine back together? You know, how would that work, right? You would assume that he would just remain as different pieces and then fall apart. So there's lots of different questions you can bring up with this. Some of them seem to end after death, and some of them seem to not end after death. That just seems to be the case here. I don't think it's an inconsistency with Oda. It's just him showing that, like, every devil fruit is different. There's so many ones that have different crazy powers out there, and you just never really know what's going to happen. So anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. This will be Tekking and Barry signing out. Oh wait, Ant Facts. Crap, I did have an Ant Fact today. Okay, Ant Fact intro, go! Alright, so today we are talking about the Dracula ant. Dracula ant. Okay, so despite the really cool name, and considering they're called the Dracula ant, I'm assuming that you're assuming what they're capable of doing. You know, they suck the blood out of their own larva. Yeah, that's the direction we're going, because that's what they do. So they live in Madagascar. There's about 14 species that fall under this title of Dracula ant in this genus. And most of them are blind. However, they do have very different appearances. Like, these are both classified as Dracula ants. They both look very different, okay? And most of them are blind, though, or don't even have any eyes at all. Very strong pincers. They are capable of stinging, okay? And they live in Madagascar. There's really not a lot of information on them that I've discovered, though. We do know that they consume the blood of their larva, but they're not cannibals. They have, like, a non-destructive form of cannibalism where they do eat their own species, but not to the point where they die. It's like a weird parasitic relationship with your own, your own family, I guess, right? So the larvas are there, and the adults will suck the blood from the larva, but they'll still leave enough for the larva to survive, and then the larva will eventually grow up and become an ant, and then do the same thing. And this is how they survive. And that was really all the information I could really pull on these things, but they're called Dracula ants, for God's sake. I had to talk about them, and now you know about their existence. So there you go. There's the ant fact for the day. Ant facts! All right, so now, for real, thanks for watching, everybody. This will be Tekking and Barry signing out. Later.